Welcome to the second episode in my gardening series. Last week I showed you my process for building and using a soil sifter, and the next question that I had is, what did that process really do for my soil? Today I'm going to be concentrating a little more about the science inside the soil. Now there are some really great videos on YouTube already about this subject, like the Science Basement's Introduction to Soil. I'm not going to go into too much detail in this episode, so if you want to know a little more about where I'm sourcing my information, head on over and check them out. This series is about taking the existing knowledge and showcasing experimental, practical, and procedural designs to give you some ideas about how to build and improve your garden's results. So what I'm going through today is a few tests on the soil I separated, the raw soil, and some wood ash from the fire pit, which can be used as a soil amendment. I'm going to be testing the porosity, texture, pH, and nutrient levels of each of these samples. The goal of this test is to determine the best mix of materials that I have on hand to increase the productivity of my garden plants. This saves me from spending extra money on soils and amendments. Now, if you live in Montana's Gallatin Valley, the results I come up with may be close to what your soil is like. But if you don't live here, these tests are easily repeatable with your own soils and conditions. Now let's go get some samples. So now that we have some samples, it's time to start the tests. The first characteristic I want to test is soil porosity. Now, healthy soil is made up of 5% organic material, 45% loam, which I'll go over a little bit later, 25% air, and 25% water. Soil porosity is an important factor in allowing that 50% of air and water access to your plant's roots. To put it simply, it's the space between all of the different parts of your soil, and it's where the magic of life happens. So how do we measure this? Well, to keep it simple, I'm just going to take the soil in the jar and fill it with water until it just covers the top. Then it's just a simple calculation, dividing the volume of water that we put in by the volume of soil to get a percent that represents the soil's porosity. Ideally, we want this to be as close to 50% as possible. But what about the water that's already in the sample? I've got an idea about that. I'm going to place the sample on a low heat in this toaster oven for about 2 hours to try to evaporate as much water as I can without causing any unwanted chemical changes in the sample. When the samples have cooled to room temperature, I'm going to loosely measure 200 milliliters of each sample and return it to the jar, and the excess I'm going to put aside for the next tests. Starting with the first sample, I'm going to measure out 200 milliliters of water and add it slowly to the dry soil until it just covers the top of the soil. Then I take a reading of water left in the measuring cup. It looks like there's 80 to 90 milliliters left in the cup. In this test, I want to look at soil texture of the samples. In basic terms, soil texture is the mixture of 3 different particle sizes: sand, silt, and clay. The best type of soil texture for agriculture is called loam. As you can see on the triangle, there are different types of loam, meaning that your soil can have up to 70% sand, 80% silt, or 40% clay, and still be called loam. So why does texture really matter? Well, it's a good way to regulate the permeability of your soil. Permeability is the ability of soil to absorb, retain, and drain water. Good loam soil maintains a half and half balance of air and water. So with sandy soil, you need to use a greater amount of water to grow your plants. And with more silt in your soil, the greater chance you'll get root damage. With too much clay, soil becomes a barrier to water, limiting the depth the roots can grow. This test is simple, and it just takes a little bit of time. Using the jar from our first test, I'm going to add an additional 200 milliliters of water to the sample, which gives a total volume of about 400 milliliters. That fits nicely into the pint jar I'm using and gives a little bit more than 70 milliliters airspace for mixing. Now, just screw on the cap and mix it all up. Within a minute, the heaviest particles of sand are going to settle out of the mixture. When they do, take a marker and draw a line on the jar at the top of the sand layer. Then it will take about an hour for the silt to settle out of the water. And when it does, make a line on top of the silt layer right above the line for the sand layer. After a day, the rest of the clay particles should settle out of the water. Once you have your third line, measure the total height of each layer and add them together. Then take the height of each layer and divide it by that total. And you have your percent of each of the soil separates. Now, when you're doing this test, don't worry too much about being exact with your measurements, because this is only a sample of a much larger bed. The point is to get an approximate idea of your soil texture, rather than control it to a precise degree, because your plants won't notice a 1 or 2% difference. Next, I want to test the pH of the samples. pH plays an important role in the ability of a plant to take in the nutrients of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You may have heard these referred to as NPK. Depending on what the pH of your soil is, will depend on how freely these nutrients are absorbed into the plant's roots. Another important point is that the acidic or basic nature of your soil may need to be different, depending on what plants you're growing. So this test is good to perform throughout the growing season to ensure your garden's health and success. To perform the pH and NPK tests, I decided to go with a ready-made kit by Environmental Concepts I found on Amazon for around $20. I'll put a link down in the description for the product, but I'm not being paid by either this company or Amazon to promote the product. There are several options when you want to test pH and nutrient levels, like in-ground digital probes, capsule tests, and indicator papers. I chose this kit because I wanted to have a chemical test for this video to fit with the other tests, and because I think it's a little more accurate. Plus, it has enough reagents to accomplish all of the tests I currently have planned. One downside I found with this kit is that it doesn't have any reordering information for when I run out of test samples, but it does come with a good deal of information on how to correct issues the tests identify. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the steps to these tests because depending on what you're using for your tests, the methods and chemicals involved may be completely different. The main thing to note here is that I'm not using distilled water for this test because my water comes from a well, and that's what I'm going to use to irrigate the garden. So it will provide an accurate idea of what my plants are really getting. As with the other tests, I will go over the results at the end of the video. Now, on to the nutrient testing. The nutrient testing, it establishes what each of the samples already has, so I don't over-fertilize and burn the plants. One of the more important elements that plants need is nitrogen, because nitrogen is a critical part of protein. It's the amino in amino acids, and is a central part of the chlorophyll molecule, so your plants need a healthy supply of it. Without a good source of nitrogen, your plants are not going to grow very large, and the leaves will start to yellow. Although I'm not sure of the specific chemicals involved in this test because the kit didn't tell me, what it is testing for is the concentration of nitrate ions, which is the form of nitrogen that plants can assimilate. A dark red color on this test indicates an abundance of nitrogen. Next, I'm going to test the samples for the presence of phosphorus. Phosphorus helps function as an energy bridge between the growth and development of plants. Like humans, plants use phosphorus for the molecule ATP, which provides cellular energy, and has a large impact on most of what the plant is doing. So if the plants don't have enough phosphorus, they aren't going to grow very large, as stunting is really the only symptom of a deficiency. This test is looking at the concentration of phosphate ions in the soil, and a dark purple color indicates a strong presence of phosphorus in the soil. For the final test, I'm looking at the concentration of potassium ions in the soil. Yes, this is actually an electrolyte. What potassium does for plants is act as a regulator for carbon dioxide intake, water intake, and enzyme activation. In other words, it supports the plant while it brings all the other elements together. Deficiencies in potassium are going to affect how well the plant can produce leaves, flowers, and food. So if your produce is developing deformed or late in the season, potassium may be the culprit. With this test, it has me comparing it to a dot pattern to determine the concentration of potassium ions. Now that I'm done with all of the tests, let's look at the results of each of the samples. These results give me a good baseline of the characteristics of the materials I have on hand. Now obviously, your soil is going to have different characteristics than mine, so I encourage you to try some of these tests if your garden's results aren't where you'd like them to be. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that taking a little time to look at the science inside the soil has been helpful. I really wanted to focus on what you can do at home to really understand your soil without spending extra money on fertilizers and amendments, by using the materials you already have. In my next episode, I'm going to put this information to work in laying out an herb garden, so join me by clicking that subscribe button. If you have any ideas about what you'd like to see in this series, leave a comment so that I can do a little research and tell you my thoughts. Also, if there's anything that you think I could have done better, please let me know. If you like this episode, share it with your friends and hit the thumbs up. I'm making these videos to simplify the process for you, the viewer, so please, grow a beautiful garden.